Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Busy week in Parliament, sitting of course last 2 weeks of the year. Here's what's coming up on Credlin. More information's been released about the 80 detainees freed now into the community after last week's High Court decision, including a child rapist and another convicted of murdering a pregnant woman. So the question is, given the government has released them, what is the government doing to address justifiable community concerns about safety? I'll speak to a parent tonight who's leading a campaign against unisex bathrooms being forced at her child's school in Victoria. Now, would you believe it? Rather than engaging with concerned parents, Victorian Department of Education is threatening these primary school mums with criminal sanctions. More information released too, as I said there, about those detainees out on the weekend. A shocking weekend here and around the world for the Jewish community. 300,000 marched through the streets of London on Remembrance Day. And here we had war memorials in Australia vandalised with pro-Palestinian graffiti. We'll cross to London a little later. And the PM actually taking some time out of his busy international schedule to turn up to the Parliament today, faced the coalition increasingly concerned about community discontent, cost of living pain, and a government that looks out of touch.
Why are Australians paying the price for a distracted and out-of-touch Prime Minister failing to focus on the real issues affecting Australians?
Why are Australians paying the price for a distracted Prime Minister failing to focus on the real issues affecting Australians?
I'm not sure in what capacity he's asked me, given I'm representing. Given I'm now representing the Treasurer.
Order.
Pretty embarrassing, but we'll come back to that. First though, Penny Wong, now calling for an Israeli ceasefire in Gaza, shows just how much Labor has changed for the worse on this issue. To say Australian Jewish leaders are dismayed is an understatement.
Talks are taking steps towards a ceasefire, which she clearly said needs to be on both sides, actually indicates that there is a view there that Hamas will retain power, and I think that's an intolerable threat.
A call for a ceasefire sounds like it's a call for peace, but in fact it's a recipe for more war.
It's a misconceived plea, I'm afraid, and quite disturbing that Australia is completely out of line with our major allies.
Now, a ceasefire now would leave the terrorist organisation Hamas weakened but not destroyed, and inevitably even more vengeful in charge of Gaza, just biding its time for another attack on the Jewish homeland it has pledged to exterminate. Despite 300,000 people marching against Israel in London, and despite 60 of his own backbenchers demanding an Israeli ceasefire, the British Labor leader, well, he's still on the side of Israel against the terrorists seeking to destroy it.
While I understand calls for a ceasefire at this stage, I do not believe that it is the correct position now, for two reasons. One, because a ceasefire always freezes any conflict in the state where it currently lies.
But here at home in Australia, Labor's been going wobbly for weeks, dismayed by the chaos in our street and no doubt intimidated by Green Left activists in its branches and the ethnic branch stacks inside the Labor Party. Tens of thousands demonstrated in Sydney and Melbourne yesterday, and on Friday evening a pro-Palestinian mob convoyed towards a synagogue in Caulfield in what was clearly a deliberate provocation designed to make Jewish Australians feel rejected in their own country. Yet instead of condemning this anti-Semitic bile, Labor leaders like Premier Jacinta Allen and Wong persist in mealy-mouthed rejections of both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, as if any of that is now in evidence, because they can't bring themselves to be clearly on Israel's side. Now, it's such a far cry from Bob Hawke's time, when Israel still had outspoken friends inside Labor. After a trip to Israel in 1971, which Hawke later described as a life-changing event, Labor's best Prime Minister described Israel as an inspiration a lone democracy, he said, in the Middle East. And he warned, and I quote, "If the bell tolls for Israel, it won't just toll for Israel, it will toll for all mankind." As the then ACTU president, Hawke was more than happy to attack Gough Whitlam's so-called even-handedness on this issue, because no decent person should be even-handed between democracy and a terrorist dictatorship. And as reported in the Australian Jewish News recently, Hawke was the first non-Israeli visitor to the Golan Heights in 1973 in the immediate aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. Labor then, but not now. Then Hawke was in Israel to show solidarity with her people, whereas it takes weeks now for Anthony Albanese to make a call to the Israeli PM. And despite almost living on an aircraft, Albanese can't find time for a solidarity visit, unlike almost all of Israel's fellow allies. There's a real lack of clarity from the Prime Minister about who is in the right here and who is in the wrong. In question time today, he couldn't even call out Penny Wong over her demands for a ceasefire, adding further to the confusion.
Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister yesterday claimed that Israel, in carrying out its defensive war against terror group Hamas, is breaching international law and should undertake a ceasefire. Is this the government's position?
The transcript of yesterday's interview showed that she did not say that. What the Foreign Minister spoke about was perfectly consistent with the motion that was moved in this Parliament that was supported by the opposition on the floor of this Parliament.
Muddled, befuddled and wrong. Because far from being humanitarian, calls for an immediate ceasefire just make racist violence more likely once Hamas is regrouped and rearmed. Australians marching against Israel, calling for it to be extinguished from the river to the sea, are greenlighting the murder of millions of Jews. They're not calling for an end to Hamas rocketing Israel. They're not calling for Hamas to have democratic elections. They're not calling for Hamas to give Palestinian the rights that Israel gives to everyone. Initially, at least, let's not forget, these rallies began as a celebration of the atrocities committed by Hamas within hours of 1,200 innocent Israelis being murdered. Now, peace is the one thing they are not calling for. And this is what the Prime Minister must make clear. How is it that journalists and cartoonists upsetting some minorities are officially harassed for months and years? The late great Bill Leak is but one example, but tens of thousands can march effectively in favour of the death of millions of Jews, some even chanting "gas the Jews," and our vast human rights police force takes no action. Now, what sort of country has such a blatant double standard? It's hard to accept how Anthony Albanese can be so muted about the anti-Semitism which is now rampant on our streets, and why the Canberra Press Gallery too. They're not working harder to get the Prime Minister off the fence. Anthony Albanese has often said his role model is Bob Hawke.
If Labor's successful in the coming federal election, I'll take my lead from Bob Hawke.
Well, learn your history, Albo. Hawke displayed moral courage and leadership on Israel, but you are wanting. So much for saying he wants to channel Bob Hawke, as so often from Anthony Albanese is all pose and no performance. Look, further to last week's High Court decision overturning a previous ruling of 2 decades standing, about 80 convicted foreigners have now been released into the Australian community. In addition to the Burmese man, and look, this is going to be tough to hear, but you need to know exactly what his crime is. This Burmese man in detention after leaving jail for anally raping a 10-year-old boy. The released detainees, including a Malaysian man convicted of murdering a pregnant woman who can't be returned to Malaysia because Australia doesn't deport people facing the death penalty. 80 odd are out on the street. These are serious criminals now at large in the community because the High Court, in a judgment with the rationale yet to be released, decided not to follow its previous precedent. Now, I can appreciate the argument that it's unfair to keep foreigners convicted of crimes here, in immigration detention indefinitely after they're out of jail if their own country won't take them back, because that effectively means life in imprisonment in Australia. But, and it's a big but, why should we have them on our streets after they've abused our hospitality in such a brutal way? There has to be a way of being fair to foreigners who've committed serious crimes without giving them the prize they want of life in Australia. Now, maybe it's released to a third country, PNG, Nauru maybe, until their home country can be persuaded to take them back. Maybe it's control orders, keeping them out there and free, sure, but watched very carefully, perhaps in isolated places where they can't do much harm to anyone but themselves. The government says it's taking steps to preserve community safety, but so far, other than fairly perfunctory reporting requirements, we haven't even seen the details of what that might be. This is an issue where the government and the opposition should be ready to work together to come up with a better way. As things stand, there's now another route now, isn't there, to permanent residency in Australia. Commit a crime so serious that your own country won't have you back, presto, do your time, and you're free to stay in Australia forever. Given how weak Labor's always been on borders, you've got to wonder how hard they even fought this case in the High Court, don't you? As I said, Parliament back today. Let's go there now for the headlines. In Canberra, Sky News senior political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
Good evening. The Foreign Minister is standing by her call for Israel to stop bombing hospitals in Gaza. She's also called for both sides to take steps towards a ceasefire. That's triggered a debate about the merits of such a ceasefire as Parliament returns. Children's shoes, teddy bears and bloody handprints. Pro-Palestine protesters converge on the lawns of Parliament. Hundreds gather to condemn Israel's war in Gaza and call for Australia to speak up.
What do you want?
The Greens, the only political party in attendance.
How many more children need to die? How many more civilians need to suffer?
The Foreign Minister on Sunday backed the need to take steps towards a ceasefire on both sides. She told Israel to stop bombing hospitals in Gaza, regardless of whether they're being used by Hamas for military operations.
We make no apologies for articulating the importance of the application of international humanitarian law. Frankly, some people have been critical of that.
It's a view that has support within Labor.
I think everyone wants to see a ceasefire. Everyone wants to see an end to this.
The coalition accused the Foreign Minister of breaking ranks with the United States and United Kingdom.
Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister yesterday claimed that Israel, in carrying out its defensive war against terror group Hamas, is breaching international law and should undertake a ceasefire. Is this the government's position?
I went on to say, but this cannot be one-sided, and I pointed out that Hamas is still attacking Israel and is still holding hostages.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
All right, a fair bit to get across. Joining me now, as he does every Monday, the Australian's national editor, Dennis Shanahan. Dennis, welcome as always. I need to get your assessment on this anti-Semitism that really has reached epidemic levels in Australia, and then the corollary of a whole lot of people inside Labor. There's sources in the papers today saying there's now serious tension within the government about how it responds to this issue. Some senior politicians are saying there's red-hot anger in Labor electorates. The president of the Islamic Council of Victoria, Adel Salman, says the Muslim community has, quote, substantially turned against Labor. So Labor's saying not enough is being done to support the pro-Palestinian movement. Rank and file members, we're told, to are resigning. On the other side, what you can see demonstrated is not Islamophobia, Dennis, it's anti-Semitism. And there are very serious Jewish leaders now calling for the Prime Minister to stand up and do more to condemn it. Give us your sense of things.
Well, indeed, there are tensions within the Labor Party. Clearly, we saw a debate at the last national conference over enhancing their position on Palestine. And so this has been developing for quite a while. There's been institutional change within the Labor Party, particularly the New South Wales Labor Party, over the last 30 to 40 years. There is now a progressive support for Palestine, where once there was a pro-US, pro-Israel position. And I think what we're seeing, as well as this institutional shift, as the march comes through the universities and into the political parties, including the Greens, we actually have a demographic shift with its own politics, putting pressure on the ALP, where we have 10 of the top 12 electorates in Australia with the highest levels of people of Middle Eastern heritage. 10 are Labor. The top 3 are all held by Labor ministers, all in Western Sydney. So there is enormous internal pressure on the Labor Party, but even so, this doesn't account for the confusion, for the lack of clarity in the government's position towards Israel and, of course, anti-Semitism.
I made the point, though, I mean, Bob Hawke went to Israel in 71, he met with Golda Meir, he went back in 73. The first non-Israeli there on the ground in the Yom Kippur War, the aftermath of that, he came back to Australia, ACTU president as he was then, went toe-to-toe with Gough Whitlam and said, you can't be even-handed with these radical dictatorships and the democracy of Israel. I reject this play. We're seeing it with some leaders. We're seeing it with the Liberal leader in Victoria, John Pizzuto. The moment he speaks about anti-Semitism, he's got to throw Islamophobia in there. Now, I'm not seeing people turn up to mosques and stop people going to Friday prayers like we're seeing in the synagogues in Melbourne. So I guess my concern is you've got Keir Starmer, the Labor leader in the UK. He had 60 of his own backbench demand a stronger position on Palestine. He says no. We're doing the right thing by Israel. He's saying, I reject a ceasefire. He had one of his frontbenchers resign, but Albanese, he's been all but silent on this issue.
Well, he has made some comments, and today in Parliament, he went so far as to say he condemned the motorcade, the provocative motorcade that went through the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and of course, the protests outside the synagogue. I made a point in the Australian's website this afternoon that we haven't seen Israeli protesters going outside mosques in Lakemba. So there is no need for equivalence. There is. Now, there is a point where, of course, we don't want to see anti-Semitism, nor do we want to see Islamophobia, nor sectarianism or any other racism or discrimination. But the point is, at the moment, it is Jews who are the target of some very vile campaigns, violent protests, and more threats to come, including death threats. And so what we should not see is a conflation of the argument about what Israel is doing with what Jews must suffer in Australia as a result. And this requires political leadership from Anthony Albanese, clarification from Penny Wong to separate the global security issue of what amounts to tensions and war in the Middle East to what is a domestic security issue, ensuring the citizens of Australia have freedom of movement and are not afraid. This is where there is no room for equivalence, and it should be purely at the moment on the issue of anti-Semitism and seeking what we can do to prevent it. There was no equivalence during the Cronulla riots when people of Middle Eastern appearance were being targeted by drunken brawlers. The New South Wales police stepped in with batons and pepper spray to defend those people who were clearly under threat from a much larger aggressive group.
I think you turn your mind to a Kevin Rudd or a John Howard or a Tony Abbott. I don't think that I've only made a couple of comments about anti-Semitism and what has been a very difficult month now since the atrocities. I think the Prime Minister is wanting. I think he's being shown up as weak across the board. We saw that Resolve poll, and more than half the electorate now says cost of living is the biggest issue for us. It's a test for Labor. He's had falling support in that Resolve poll. He's had a quite significant support drop last week out of News poll. All the foreign travel, you know, it's hurting him. I can see it too. We've got APEC coming up. He'll leave Australia again. I can't understand why on earth he doesn't send the Deputy Prime Minister to APEC. I think he's got fires at home. Cost of living is one of them. This issue about cohesion in the community obviously is a bigger other issue for us, Dennis. He needs time behind his desk, in my view.
I think that's right, and I think that the Prime Minister recognises that himself. I think it would have been better to send Richard Marles as the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister for Defence, as well as the former Minister for the Pacific. He is perfectly prepared to be able to handle the Pacific Island Forum meeting. Another indication that the Prime Minister feels that his overseas travel is hurting him. This is the first parliamentary sitting today that we've had since the Prime Minister met the President of the United States in the United States and the President of China in China. Now, this was a significant series of meetings, and it was the first time an Australian Prime Minister met the Chinese President in more than 7 years. And yet today in Parliament, Mr Albanese left the issue of China to the last question in question time. Number 18 was the question he was asked about China. He dealt with it quickly and then called an end to question time. Labor can see the damage the overseas travel is doing to the Prime Minister, and that Resolve poll that you point to, we didn't really need a poll to know cost of living is the top problem for the public, and that now that the distraction of the Indigenous referendum has gone, that people are concentrating even more so on the government's performance. But that Resolve poll was taken before the interest rate increase. Imagine what it would have shown if it had been taken after the interest rate increase. The government has got a problem in these last couple of weeks of Parliament of not having a positive agenda to replace what was the agenda of the Indigenous voice to Parliament.
Which was a catastrophic failure. Dennis Shanahan, thank you. Let's go down to Clifton Springs. It's a little town just outside of Geelong in Victoria, where parents from a local government-run primary school are rallying against the introduction of gender-neutral toilet blocks at the school. Now, the issue's caused so much concern locally that some parents have removed their kids from the school. Joining me now, one of those parents, Chelsea Hogan, and Federal Shadow Education Minister Sarah Henderson. Well, ladies, welcome to you. Chelsea, I want to start with you. I know your neck of the woods. My mum's not far from you in another little town, and I know that it's a really tight-knit community. You've been threatened by the Education Department with criminal action for speaking out on this issue. What concerns you about gender-neutral toilets for little kids?
I think the biggest thing for me as a parent is that we've always taught our children to protect themselves, to speak up when they feel uncomfortable. And our children have come to us with very legitimate concerns and just a real feeling of unease since these toilets have been introduced into the school. And as parents, it's our job to speak up for our children. And we have done so. And I've gone through every correct channel possible. And I have been blatantly ignored, dismissed, sometimes even belittled. And just nobody seems to care that our kids are uncomfortable with these new toilets. And we are so aware of the need for safe spaces for gender diverse students. We're not against unisex toilets. We just want a safe space for boys, girls and unisex facilities. And we want them separate because we believe that every child deserves the right to privacy and dignity. And boys and girls are just so different. Like their needs are so different. And I just feel like that's being ignored.
Sarah Henderson, help me out here. I mean, why on earth do we even need gender-neutral toilets in a primary school?
Well, Peter, good evening and great to join you. And as we saw from the rally at Clifton Springs, many parents are concerned about this issue. And as Chelsea has said, no one is objecting to a unisex toilet. But at Clifton Springs Primary School, boys and girls are being forced to share the same bathroom facilities. And with boys and girls particularly, going through puberty and all the challenges that involves, this is very compromising for their dignity, for their privacy. Some children are actually not going to the toilet. And so I'm outraged that the Department of Education has threatened both Chelsea and another mum, Jessica, with criminal charges for stalking as a result of distributing a flyer about this rally. It is absolutely outrageous. I've called on the Education Minister to withdraw these threats from his department, to apologise and to reinstate separate boys and girls facilities at this school. And so far we have heard nothing, and it's absolutely not good enough, Peter.
What sort of consultation did mums and dads get about this?
None.
None at all?
None. Apparently it went out in a newsletter about 2 years ago that there would be new toilets, there would be unisex toilets, and we were assured that they would still be separate boys and girls toilets. There's even a plan of what the toilets were going to be like, and they've turned out nothing like that. So we feel very misled and very lied to. And I don't know why they're doing this, and I don't know why there's been so much secrecy around it.
And what do people of Clifton Springs and Drysdale think about it?
It's so divided because there are so many people who, like us, passionately loved our primary school. It was such a welcoming, beautiful community. This has caused so much division amongst all of us because you've got parents with true, genuine concerns, and then you've got parents that just don't realise that there are problems with this.
Yep.
So it's caused so much division. I'm going to go as far
and I've got to say this,
hate.
I mean, it's a brutal reality nowadays. I mean, you get little girls in grade 6 getting a period. It's not something that happens when they're in secondary school anymore. And I mean, it's challenging enough for a child, but to manage that in grade 6, even grade 5, sharing a toilet with boys, pretty tough.
Really tough. And not only that, you've got 5-year-old little girls and boys who are now sharing a space with grade 6 boys and girls. And to me, there's a real risk there. There's a lot of children that have trauma backgrounds. There's a lot of children who believe that inappropriate behaviour is normal.
Yeah.
And I just feel like there's a huge risk that seems to be mismanaged and hasn't been looked at properly.
Sarah, just quickly before we go, I want to ask you that study out today that autism in Australia is, I think, some of the highest in the world. There is an argument from a child psychologist, I think he is, certainly a medico, that this relates to the NDIS, that there's a financial incentive to get your child on the NDIS if they've got some level of learning difficulty. What do you say to the reports?
Well, Peter, parents deserve a transparency about the NDIS, and so far under this government, Bill Shorten has not done this. He promised that the NDIS would be sustainable. He promised that he would manage the growth of the NDIS, but now he's keeping secret a report into the NDIS. And frankly, parents deserve much better from this government, including assurances that the now minister gave before the last election. The government has been playing politics with the NDIS for far too long, and it is about time that the minister came clean, particularly with NDIS participants.
Well, thank you, Chelsea. I know that Mum and Dad Power, People Power, will win over down your way, but keep it up.
Thank you.
I know you get a lot of support. All right, let's leave it there. After the break, we'll get into the 80 people released, including a murderer and a pedophile, out of detention into the community. Plus, Victoria's Supreme Court has ruled against the Health Department unlawfully shutting down a catering business. You know the bloke, Ian Cook, is now running for Daniel Andrews' old seat of Mulgrave. The election's on Saturday. Coming up, we'll speak to the wonderful Ian Cook in the running to replace Daniel Andrews in his former seat now, of Mulgrave. By-election this Saturday. Big win for him in the Supreme Court today against Brett Sutton. I'll let him tell you all about it. But first, let's go to that High Court decision last week that overturned a 20-year precedent that allowed the indefinite detention of foreign-born individuals who entered Australia with or without a visa, perhaps came with one but later cancelled, and they're now in circumstances where it's almost impossible to deport them. Already we find that 80 people have been freed. They're on the streets, but we don't know where they are, we don't know who they are, nor do we know the full extent of the crimes committed. But we do know that some of these people have committed serious, violent and sexual crimes. Here was the minister today, the minister responsible, Andrew Giles. Doesn't look like he's across the detail. Have a listen.
Community safety has been our number one priority in anticipation of the decision and since it's been handed down. So I want to reassure your listeners that from day one, the AFP and Border Force have been working closely with state and territory authorities while we consider all measures that may be available to ensure community protection.
I tell you a tip, when you see a minister like that have to read from his notes and not even put his head up, you know he is not across his brief. Join me now for the latest, Australian's legal contributor, Chris Merritt. Well, Chris, what's the latest? I know we haven't got the judgment yet. Confirmation, though, that 80 of these people have been released. We don't know where they are in the community. One's a murderer who killed a pregnant woman, then blew up her body. We know the other is a pedophile who raped a 10-year-old boy. You can understand why people are worried, can't you?
You certainly can. But the thing that's most shocking about this, the government should have seen this coming a mile off. There's a string of cases dating back to June last year. We've had a couple of terror-related dual citizenship cases, and we've had this latest one with this Rohingya person. And the underlying principle in all of them has been the High Court's hard line on the separation of powers and its refusal to allow the federal government, any federal government, to enact a law that would infringe on the judicial right to impose penalties. And in all those cases, those two terror-related cases and in this one, in the Rohingya case, that's the underlying principle. And way back when these laws were first enacted, Labor was warning that there was a danger that these things could be struck down. And it's happened. You could see it coming last year when Mr. Delil Alexander had his citizenship restored on this ground. So it's astounding that the government hasn't wheeled out legislation straight away saying this is how we're going to remedy this sort of thing. It's not just the dual citizenship cases, the terror-related cases, but it's this one, the indefinite detention of people that we can't deport to other countries. There must be a way around it. And if you have a look at here's a hint for the government, you might want to have a look at the leading judgment in the Ben Breaker case, which was handed down the beginning of this month. And the High Court goes
a convicted terrorist, I remind people, a convicted terrorist.
But the High Court goes out of its way to provide hints for the government on how to enact a law that it would pass muster with the High Court. We haven't seen this. It should have been wheeled out immediately.
Of course it should. And Chris, you know, people at home can understand we've got 2 weeks of Parliament. If the opposition, which it has said, would support legislation to remediate this loophole, if I can call it that, it could pass this Parliament and be law by Christmas. Yet we've got 80 people out, potentially more. And I don't have any confidence, listening to the Minister there, Giles, in that ABC interview, but of course in question time as well, I don't have any confidence he's got a handle on the risk these people pose, or that there's enough in terms of controls. What else should be on the table, do you think?
Look, I think I suspect if we've got responsible administration going on, there'll be significant control orders and supervision orders and bail-like conditions imposed on these people. I'd be stunned if it were otherwise. But it would be nice to know about it. It would be a great reassurance to the community to spell it out and make it clear exactly what the restrictions are on these people. These are dangerous people that other countries refuse to accept. And for reasons that should have been blindingly obvious to the government, the High Court has decided that the law that was used to lock them up doesn't pass muster. It should have been addressed. They should have had statute waiting so that in the event that this outcome happened, they could move quickly to remedy the problem.
Chris, I've got to leave it there. I'm out of time. But as I said at the top of the show, you've got to wonder how hard they even fought it, knowing that Labor does not like detention. We'll come back to some other issues related to that tomorrow. Now let's go to Victoria. Big win today in the Supreme Court for Ian Cook's business, his former business, I Cook Foods. It was, of course, shut down by Professor Brett Sutton when he was running the Department of Health with invalid orders, so says the court today, of an alleged contamination issue in February 2019. The court today found the Health Department, quote, failed to observe procedural fairness when shutting down I Cook Foods 4 years ago. It also found the department failed to observe the rules of natural justice. Well, joining me now is Ian Cook, off the campaign trail. I know you've got your big vote on Saturday. We'll get to that in a moment. But, I mean, you have had a massive win today in the Supreme Court. We've talked about this issue many, many times. It's cost you a lot of money. You've seen it all the way through. You haven't got compensation. We'll get to that in a moment. But how do you feel knowing you were right, now being able to prove it?
Oh, it's great. It feels very good to be vindicated. It's taken a long time, as you said, and the result of Sutton being wrong was what we've said all along, which means we were telling the truth, they weren't, and they were trying to cover it up.
He's quit his job now and he's off, I think, in the world of academia. You didn't get compensation out of this, but I'll say that's yet you didn't get compensation. You're still going to push for it, aren't you?
Correct. There's a few things in it. First, we have to make sure that this never happens to another business again. And part of this fight is to ensure that, because at the moment, government officials can shut a business down with no consequences. I mean, that's extraordinary, and it's certainly not very Australian. And
you're a big business. This has cost you tens of millions of dollars.
Correct. Yes. Oh, yeah. It's pretty much taken everything that we'd built over 40 years. Having said that, we intend fighting on. I can tell you that we will be issuing against the City of Greater Dandenong for malicious prosecution next week. And not only that, we will also be issuing personally against the two officers, so Elizabeth Garlick and Leanne Johnson.
Wow.
Because people have to be held to account. And what we're doing, hopefully, will protect others down the track.
I feel like I've been on this journey with you. I mean, I'm really proud of you. I know this has taken a huge toll on you and your family. So congratulations tonight, Ian. I know some in the Labor Party are a bit concerned about a likely swing against them at Mulgrave on Saturday. I don't know why on earth the Liberal Party's running against you. They should be supporting your campaign because you got such a huge vote at last year's state election against the Premier. How's it looking? You had a few days to go. How can people help?
Okay, so it's very positive on the ground. All the support that was there appears to have come back, and a lot of people coming up saying very kind words. But also people who didn't vote for me last time who've said, no, we've had enough. We don't, that this is the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak.
Wow.
Labor are swamping the electorate with media advertising. So if anybody wants to help us, and they could go to iancook.com.au, we could really do with it, particularly in these last few days.
So money if they've got it. I know people are doing it tough, but this is a big fight against the big boys. Money if they've got it, go to iancook.com, but also, I presume, volunteers to help you hand
Correct.
out. Yep, all of that.
Yep, that would be great.
How do you feel?
I feel really good about it. All I can do is my best, and that's what I'm doing. If I become the member for Mulgrave, then I can get in. Then I can also make noise to prevent some of the things that are going wrong at the moment. And it's not just the problems like what you see has happened to us, but it's also being able to fight just land tax. You've got no idea how many what we used to call the Greeks and Italians, etc., who had two jobs, worked hard, got a couple of investment properties. They are absolutely bleeding. They're just
right across the state.
It is ridiculous.
Keep them honest. Let's hope you get in there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Terrific bloke. I mean, I tell you, he has fought so hard. Vindicated today. Still more to come. If you're voting in Mulgrave, help get him over the line. All right, after the break, we're going to go to London for all the horrific scenes, I guess, out of the Remembrance Day weekend there. over Saturday and Sunday, and also why the Australian economy is falling down the rankings in every key measure of economic success. Coming up, a government out of touch and Australia falling fast down all the international economic rankings. We'll get to that with the panel in a moment, but first let's go to London, where over the weekend 300,000 pro-Palestinian protesters converged on central London, making it one of the biggest marches in British history. Around 150 demonstrators were detained, 9 police officers injured. Some officers were injured preventing a violent crowd getting to the cenotaph while a remembrance service took place. Really disgusting stuff, isn't it? Joining me on the ground is Tom Slater, editor for Spiked Online and a contributor to the UK's Spectator magazine. Tom, thank you for your time. I was in London a couple of weeks ago. I saw a very large rally, 100,000 or so in and around Piccadilly, but 300,000, I was shocked you had them there again on this Remembrance Day weekend. I thought they would have stayed away in deference to the historical and respectful tone of the weekend, but not the case. How have British people responded to this?
I think British people are sickened by what they're seeing, because what we're witnessing here really is the birth or the explosion of an anti-Semitic street protest movement. That's essentially what this is. We shouldn't mince words about it. I mean, what we saw on Saturday at this supposed March for Peace was people repeating Arabic war slogans about the slaughter of Jews in the 7th century. There's video footage of people saying "kill all the Jews" quite openly. There's placards in which the Star of David is presented with a swastika in the heart of it, and people suggesting that Gaza is paired with Auschwitz. Again, racist taunt after racist taunt. And even if you want to dismiss that as a few bad apples, as a lot of people, particularly on the British left, have tried to do, the organisers of this march, the Daily Telegraph did an investigation the other week. Half of the groups who are behind organising these marches have links to Hamas, and not even kind of 6 degrees of separation. We're talking about one of the groups in particular was founded by a former Hamas chief who for some reason now lives in London. So we need to take this very, very seriously. I think not since the black shirts have we seen such a sustained intimidatory presence on Britain's streets in menacing the Jewish community. And what sickens me most is that there are still many people in positions of influence who don't seem to be taking it that seriously at all.
No, and I do not want to be accused of downplaying the anti-Semitism, but I have to say there's an anti-Christian element now creeping into a lot of these protests. So if you think you're not Jewish and it doesn't bother you, or something you shouldn't have to worry about, I tell you, you do. Because the saying goes, doesn't it, they came for me and then they will come for you. Home Secretary Suella Braverman, she really went after the police. She said they play favourites when it comes to protesters. She made the point about COVID. We saw that here. The Black Lives Matter protesters, well, they were fine, but anyone else who was out there not doing what they should have been during lockdown, they were taken to task by the police. There's been calls for her to resign, but also a lot of Brits saying she needs to keep speaking out. Give us the take, or your take, on the sort of the issue with British police.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that Suella Braverman is absolutely right to suggest that the police have remarkable double standards where protests and free speech are concerned. During lockdown, she made this example herself. You had anti-lockdown protesters who had their collars felt, were fined, were arrested. Within weeks, we had the Black Lives Matter protests in which they got a much softer hand, shall we say, and even were greeted by some police officers who decided to take the knee. In recent days, there's been a scandal in this country over a gender-critical woman who's been interviewed by the police because she supposedly misgendered someone on the internet. Meanwhile, you've got anti-Semitic slogans being chanted with seeming impunity on Britain's streets. So on that question, I think it's completely unassailable. And to be honest, the response from many people suggesting that she's undermining the police and so on, these are rightful criticisms. I understand that the point that she is the Home Secretary, she's in a position to do things about this. She shouldn't be carrying on just like a pundit, carping from the sidelines. I get that criticism. But to suggest that it was illegitimate of her to raise these concerns, that these things don't exist, I think is ridiculous. And I've been very dismayed by the way in which this discussion of these marches has just become effectively a kind of rage against Suella Braverman, rather than talking about the actual issues involved. But naturally, it's all just become using her as a kind of punch bag rather than dealing with the proper issues that we need to confront in this issue.
Tom, I'm just about out of time, but just quickly, I mean, the commentary that I've listened to over the last 48 hours says that these protests are going to continue every single weekend. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like for the foreseeable future, they're showing no signs of abating. It was the biggest one that we've seen so far. And I think ordinary people really need to take this very, very seriously. I don't want to see a crackdown. I don't think you can fight this kind of hatred with censorship, but I think everyone does need to stand up against these protests because of the open bigotry on display, because of how much British Jews are being menaced at this point, and also because of a point that you made, which is that anti-Semitism is a particularly deranging form of racism. When a society has such open expressions of it, you know you're going down a particularly dark path. So I would just urge everyone with a conscience, essentially, to oppose what is going on, because history won't be kind to those people who don't.
Tom Slater, thank you. I'll make the point, though, in France, too, over the weekend, 100,000 marched against anti-Semitism, so that gives me some hope. And if I think Emmanuel Macron is on the wrong tram with the idea of a ceasefire. All right, after the break, one Labor Premier out there wants Canberra's taxpayers to fund the policing of pro-Palestinian protests. Peter Costello says, get your hands off the Future Fund, speaking out against suggestions that Labor want to raid it. Welcome back. Another concerning report from the Institute of Public Affairs released overnight showing that we are ranking pretty badly in economic terms. In terms of the world's most resilient economies, we have fallen from 20th place, from first place to 20th place. We were number one in 2004. We've also dropped 15 places on economic competitiveness. We've dropped from 21 to 52 on quality of energy infrastructure as well. Let's discuss it now. Deputy Director of the IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild. And as always on a Monday, Former Resources Minister, LNP member for Hinkler, Keith Pitt. Well, Daniel, 1 to, 2020, pretty shocking fall. It's not the only report. There's plenty out there to say we're doing poorly in economic terms, but this is pretty damning.
Yeah, that's right, Peter. It's exactly as you've outlined. On all major policy areas, Australia is going backwards and fast. And the question is, well, why does competitiveness matter? Well, if you can't compete, you can't make and you can't produce. And if you can't produce things that have value in the world, then there's no wealth to pay for our social services, our schools, our roads and hospitals and so forth. And we're seeing a dramatic deterioration in our productive capacity of our economy. And at the same time, as you know, Peter, as our supply side is going backwards, the government is cranking up the demand side with record migration, committed to 1.5 million more migrants over the next 5 years, which would be the biggest surge in our nation's history. And even the Reserve Bank has said, look, if your productivity is going down and your population's going up, you're going to have inflation, cost of living problems and high interest rates. And that's exactly what we're seeing.
And of course, the OECD too, Keith Pitt, gave us the worst result, the worst report card in terms of cost of living. We've dropped faster and further than anyone else over the last 12 months.
Well, the only question here is what's changed, Peter? Well, you have a Labor government. And we see wage increases that aren't keeping up with inflation. We see inflation continuing to increase. We see the cost of living, whether it's food or electricity or gas or fuel, continue to go up. And who's paying for it? Well, it's the Australian people. And we've seen in the parliament even today, there's just not much interest from the Labor government about how to help the Australian people. And they are really doing it tough right now.
And what about the calls today, Daniel, from Chris Minns in New South Wales? He says he wants federal taxpayers to pay for the policing in relation to all these pro-Palestinian rallies.
Well, it's passing the buck, Peter. I mean, why is it that governments could lock literally millions of Australians in their homes for months, but apparently they can't stop these protests? It doesn't make sense. This is not a practical issue. This is not a dollars and cents issue. This is a moral issue. And many of our political leaders lack the moral clarity and courage to take this on. I think Australians are looking at this, and exactly as John Howard has said, and exactly as you've written about, Peter, in your recent column, this is raising serious questions about the future of multiculturalism in this country when we see social cohesion breaking down and a lack of this clear moral clarity from our government. Australians are waking up and saying, I don't know what country I live in anymore. This should not be happening. And we need a clear guidance from government that this must end.
Quick one, Keith. A report out today from the Gas Appliance Manufacturers Association. The ban comes in on gas on new connections in Victoria from the 1st of January. They're saying it's going to cost 1,300 jobs in our industry.
Well, if there's no gas and there's no exploration and you ban gas appliances, Victoria will be cooking with coal, Peter, because that's where it'll come from. Because I'll guarantee you, there's no offshore wind farms coming. The people will oppose them. They are collapsing around the world. They are not economically viable. They're not technically feasible. And in Victoria, you'll have more coal-fired production, you'll have more electricity demand, and that's what will power Victoria.
Jen's got to leave it there. Thank you for your time. Coming up, Andrew Bott, of course, but Peter Costello says, and he's right, $200 billion future fund. Get your hands out of it, Labor, but that will be the next fight. Right, see you tomorrow night at 6.